attention because I'm a narcissist, supposed, because I'm scared of being alone.
Pathetic.
I know Marvel's in a very bad place when I see the Marvel Studios logo and I go from this to this, because it was one heck of an ordeal to watch the episodes of the show. But before I start talking about the episodes individually, I like to dedicate the segment to talk about the main premise of the show. That everything is destined to happen because three space entities called the Timekeepers dictate the events in the proper flow of time, and starting from here, the other events and plots of the show will unravel. So in other words, there is no free will. Even though Loki acted according to his will by running away with the Tesseract, he's soon stopped by the TVA authorities for proceeding against the sacred timeline. So if you have a will but you can't fully proceed as you want without being restrained by others that settled what you're supposed to do, then you're not truly free. Which is madness given that we had a whole franchise for the past 10 years or so, whose main developments, growth, and arcs were developed from choices and deeds derived from the unhampered free will of those characters. To make hard choices, to struggle, to make mistakes and learn from them, and how those things will impact their future choices and shape them throughout the movies were important and contributed in making those characters more fleshed out and likable. However, most of this loses its impact once we know that if any of those characters were to proceed differently, the TVA would interfere and reset the whole thing. But worse than the TVA interfering is the fact that everything those characters did in those movies because they were predetermined to, because it was all set up by the Timekeepers, and not because they had free will. And if there's no free will, then there is no room for risks, stakes, and growth. And if those things are absent, then why should we care? So with that being said, let's talk about it. The story starts when 2012 Loki escapes with the Tesseract as we saw in Avengers Endgame. He goes to a desert in Mongolia. However, a bunch of soldiers show up and Loki is taken to a court because he's accused of being a variant and breaking what is called to be the sacred timeline, because his survival was never supposed to happen, because actually everything that happens is predetermined to, because three space lizards said so. Maybe Loki's character should have been consistent with what he was shown to be for years in the MCU by being shrewd and smart instead of leaving the freaking Infinity Stone that allowed him to escape from imprisonment a few minutes ago abandoned in the middle of the sand, out of his reach when the Tesseract could have also helped him escape from the TVA altogether. This is straight up character disservice because Loki would never be this careless and dumb, and yet he simply forgets about the freaking Tesseract, which could open up a portal when he needed it the most. It's also extremely irritating how Loki's character keeps getting toned down throughout the show. Loki starts off as a menacing, powerful character in the MCU. We can see this clearly in the first Thor movie and in Avengers 2012, how he was built up as a calculus, mischievous, threatening villain. The way he used his powers and words to achieve his plans also contributed in making him a great and one of the most popular Marvel characters. So it's very frustrating to see him treated like a dumb prisoner by the TVA employees in the TVA's facility. Loki was already arrested before, and even though he was a prisoner, he was still feared because people knew how dangerous Loki could be. So to see him being pushed around from one room to the other in low-effort funny scenes was really bad, and it humiliates what a great character Loki used to be in the past. So Loki is now on trial and the TVA judge says that the Avengers traveling back in time was supposed to happen, whereas Loki's escape was not. And this is where the show gets infuriatingly bad. The consequences of stating that everything happens because it was all predetermined to are disastrous. The more I think about it, the more infuriating it becomes.
Your little club decides the fate of trillions of people across all of existence at the behest of three space lizards. Yes, it's funny. It's absurd.
So everything those characters said or did throughout 10 years of MCU movies are not because they wanted to according to their own free will, but because they were predetermined to, because three space lizards called the Timekeepers said so, and if they did something that goes against the sacred timeline run by those space lizards, they will all be disintegrated.
It's not your story, Mr. Laufeyson. It never was.
So in other words, every decision, every struggle, every sacrifice, every choice all those characters made throughout all those movies and 10 years of MCU are rendered meaningless because instead of doing that based on their free will, everything they did or chose to do and impactful consequences derived from their deeds they had to bear, which gave their characters development, growth, and actual stakes, are now deprived from all meaning and impact they once had. Because the point is, there is no free will.
So everything is written. Past, present, future. There's no such thing as free will.
Well, I mean, you know, it's an oversimplification.
So am I supposed to have my mind blown because of this entire sacred timeline, people getting melted in the TVA, while all this stuff in those space lizards, which we never knew about, and that we're faithfully reconning and undermining every impactful and meaningful moment of all those characters we saw in over a decade of movies? So am I supposed to just forget about all the linearity carefully built up that made Marvel special for 10 years because of this stupid attempt of Disney Plus and the MCU to milk what was left of the Marvel Universe after Endgame at the cost of contradicting what made Marvel great in the past? The most infuriating thing, in my opinion, is how the Loki show is the ultimate embodiment of how the people in charge of this new phase of the MCU are willing to get rid of all emotional and impactful moments after all those years for the sake of serving as a plot device for the sake of the show. Moments like Steve's sacrifice in the first Avenger, Tony revealing his Iron Man identity at the end of Iron Man 1, the events of Civil War, I could go on and on here, are all devoid of all impacts and stakes they once had. Instead of being actions that emanated from their free will, and those characters facing the consequences or being changed by what they did with their free will, which would also impact the upcoming movies and arcs, those moments now have no meaning, no impact, and no stakes. There were never stakes. Why would there be any stakes when it was all part of their plan? If Thor had gone for Thanos' head in Infinity War, he would have been melted. If Gamora had committed suicide before being sacrificed by Thanos, she would have been melted. If Thanos won the final battle in Endgame, he would have been melted. All is rendered meaningless now once I realize that every single outcome that has happened in the MCU was actually a result of those space lizards and their sacred timeline, and not as a series of efforts and struggles nourished by the will that all those characters had of protecting the universe and those who live in it. Everything revolves around them and not around the characters we love to see in the MCU movies for a long time this years. It simply does mean becoming a reality once again. Don't ask why the show ruins all the world building, previous characterizations, and arcs that Marvel took years to build in a single season. But look, here's Loki again! Here's Owen Wilson, this stupid clock, and this lady. Loki's canonically bisexual. Don't ask any questions, just keep consuming our products and then wait up for next products.
Really? And who should we have?
I suspect the Avengers. You see, I only came into possession of the Tesseract because they traveled through time.
Loki is right here, which leads me to ask, how? How is the Avengers traveling back in time supposed to have happened when the reason why Loki escaped is because the Avengers traveled back in time, which created the opportunity of Loki's escape, which would never have happened had the Avengers not messed up with the timeline. Because if they never traveled back in time, Loki would have never put his hands on the Tesseract and escaped in the first place. So tolerate one and not the other makes no sense. So not only Loki escaped when he wasn't supposed to do that, but Captain America engages in a fight with his past self. He makes a mess and talks about Bucky being alive. You see, this is messing up with the timeline here, because the fight shouldn't have happened if Captain America never time traveled. In 2012, Steve shouldn't have heard about Bucky's survival, a fact that will happen 2 years in the future in The Winter Soldier. How come is that not considered as breaking the sacred timeline? How come telling 2012 Steve a pivotal fact that will happen in 2013 doesn't create a nexus event or triggers the TVA to interfere?
You enjoy hurting people? Making them feel afraid? Look at that smile. You are enjoying that. Did you enjoy hurting them?
I hate it how Loki's goals and mindset are being toned down by Owen Wilson. Like he's sort of a psychologist dealing with a problematic patient or something. Because this was part of OG Loki's character arc. Not only will this motivate Loki and lead him to his character developments, but also impact the upcoming storylines in the next movies. Why is it being undermined like that in this scene? And why is he questioning Loki when this was his role to play, settled by the Timekeepers? If Loki were to act differently from that, wouldn't the TVA interfere and reset the whole thing?
What makes Loki tick?
This is one of the dumbest lines of Owen Wilson's character. The answer can be obtained by simply watching the first Thor movie. That's how easy it is. But obviously this means nothing for Marvel Phase 4, because who cares about continuity and linearity, I guess. So Owen Wilson starts showing Loki stuff that will happen in the future, like his mother's death in Thor Dark World, but why? What is even the point of showing this to him if this Loki was predetermined to accidentally lead the enemy to his mother, resulting in her death anyway? This scene also was important for Loki's characterization back in the MCU, but why should all this matter? It's all predetermined. And now Infinity Stones are paperweights. Yes, guys. Let's grab these stones, whose powers motivated the ultimate MCU villain to slay, commit genocide, and sacrifice his own daughter to try to obtain them, whose goals were foreshadowed and slowly and gradually built up in order to culminate in the ultimate battle all Avengers would ever face in order to save the universe, and turn them into objects as useless as paperweights.
No other being has ever had the might, nay the nobility, to wield not one, but two Infinity Stones.
We actually got a lot of those. Yeah, some of the guys use them as paperweights.
Is there anything achieved by the MCU that is not being barefacedly disrespected and undermined in his face for? I genuinely want to know.
Scourge. That is the part he plays on the sacred timeline.
Maybe he wants to mix it up. Sometimes you get tired of playing the same part. Is that possible? You can change?
Not unless the Timekeepers decree it.
It's amazing how getting rid of free will also affects characterizations by depriving them of all complexity they once had. Möbius wanting to believe that Loki can change falls completely flat once we are reminded about how everything is written and predetermined to happen because of the space lizards. So if they don't want Loki to change, then he won't, even if he wants to. Remember, episode 1 makes perfectly clear that there is will, just not a free one. So all hopes Möbius has for Loki to change are useless if the Timekeepers don't want it to happen. Also, Möbius hoping for Loki to change makes no sense. Isn't he a TVA agent? Doesn't he know that everything is dictated by the Timekeepers? Why is he hoping for something that could only logically happen if Loki had free will when the show got rid of that right in episode 1? Möbius is hoping for something that is far from Loki's reach, given that, paraphrasing this character in episode 1, it's not Loki's story, it never was. Then in episode 2, Loki comes up with a theory that Avirion could hide in an apocalypse because Avirion could do anything and it wouldn't matter, given that everything would be destroyed anyway. This is proven to be true when Möbius uses a TVA gadget and no Avirion anomalies are detected. But this goes against some major points said in the first episode. First, when you have such overpowered figures like the Timekeepers, who have written and settled everything in the past, present, and future of the sacred timeline, to the point of ruining all the sense the Marvel Universe had up until now, for Avirion being capable of hiding Apocalypse to run away from the TVA agents feels incredibly dumb. They have controlled the sacred timeline for who knows how long, and yet their perfect timeline is disrupted as simple as that, right under their noses. Because the Timekeepers dictate everything, and yet the possibility of variants doing whatever it is they want in Apocalypse, because everything's gonna get destroyed anyway, exists. And second, in the first episode, the clock explains in the tutorial that if a variant did something he was not supposed to do, like being late for work, an actual example given by the super clock, the tiny action would cause a nexus event. So the fact that a variant could do anything in Apocalypse and the variant would never be detected because that wouldn't change anything given that the Apocalypse would destroy everything anyway makes no sense. Because regardless of the mass destruction, for something to change with the variant is still within the realm of possibility. Thus, the possibility of a nexus event being created by the variant still exists. So the TVA finds the Apocalypse the variant has been hiding in because Möbius used a key into the variant had left in France. So the variant has been on the run, escaping from the TVA time and time again, then why would she leave a specific thing that can be traced back to a specific place into a specific time, precisely right where she has been hiding? What's a convenience? Episode 3 begins with a very convoluted fight scene. Sylvie tries to use her powers on a TVA soldier who's talking on the phone, but given that her powers don't work, he realizes her presence and they start fighting. Given that those are some very dangerous times for the TVA, with a variant killing agents, Loki on the loose, and multiple timelines spreading out of sudden, making everyone freak out, I think it would have been reasonable for that soldier to try to sound the alarm or just shout for backup, given that 3 other soldiers were in that same hallway a few meters away from him, just close enough to hear his scream as he got disintegrated. But instead of doing anything that could help him against this intruder, who they could reasonably argue to be the variant they had been looking for, he just remains in silence and starts fighting. Also notice that both of them hesitated, so there was yet another opportunity for that soldier to try to call out for help, which was not far away from him, and try to take down this outnumbered enemy. After that, Sylvie proceeds to attack the 3 other soldiers mentioned a while ago. This specific fight was really awful. It gave me the strong impression that one of the 3 soldiers charging at her just disappeared in a split second and then he comes back out of nowhere without a reasonable explanation. The cuts and the shaky camera didn't do any favors to this fight scene at all, by the way. And we also have the soldier standing right behind Sylvie while she was busy dealing with another soldier. Notice how Sylvie had time to knock down the other guy, turn around, and then defeat this one standing right behind her, who was wielding the disintegration stick, by the way. It is one more example of the curious case of trained soldiers who find themselves in a perfect opportunity to attack their enemy on their blind side, and yet they choose to do nothing, just waiting to be defeated. Oh yes, that scene. Only if Loki used his power to help him when he needed the most. Now in episode 4, it would be such a pity if the TVA judge was the sole soldier in the whole courtroom, without any other soldier who could try to catch the girl as they both stare at each other right before jumping into the portal. And also, how could that girl who never saw a TVA agent before know how to use that gadget to the point of successfully opening up a portal in a matter of seconds to escape? What a convenience. If it was sad and effectively shown in episode 2 that a variant can do anything in Apocalypse and no variant anomalies will be detected because everything will be destroyed and die, then why is it different here in this specific Apocalypse? How is it any different than episode 2 when they are both Apocalypse events that will have the same outcome, for everyone to die? And yet, how come the anomaly was detected when Sylvie did that for a long time and was never found, and Loki did the same in Pompeii and Möbius detected nothing? Please don't tell me it's the power of love.
You like her. I mean, no wonder you have no clue what caused a Nexus event on Lamentus. You fell for yourself.
So the TVA members are actually ordinary people who were taken from their respective lives in order to serve the timekeepers, and their memories of that past life were suppressed or something, but Sylvie can access them with her powers. But if they had their own lives, then taking them from that life in order to become a TVA member wouldn't disrupt the timeline and create a Nexus event? How many TVA members are there to begin with? How many people were taken from their lives without even asking, and this is not supposed to mess up with the timeline? Oh look, it's the show stumbling on their own feet again when it comes to their own rules.
Had a whole life on the sacred timeline. Calm down, I'm a variant.
Maybe she shouldn't keep such compromising information in her TVA gadget, and also never leave such gadget with such compromised information far away from her.
Not a great plan.
That soldier could have disintegrated Loki right there. This is so ridiculous. This soldier is crawling on his back like a scared, helpless kid while still holding a stick whose tip can instantly disintegrate anyone. The fact that there is a fight going on with people getting pruned or hurt and the timekeepers are just sitting there watching the whole thing is hilarious. So Loki gets disintegrated, and I can't believe Sylvie actually did not use the prune weapon on her. And the timekeepers are actually robots now. Now in episode 5, we're introduced to the concept of the void, which is where everything pruned by the TVA goes to. For the past 4 episodes, it really looks like to be pruned is to be killed. Basically death by disintegration, not hey, we're gonna dump you in this place to be eaten by this angry cloud instead. I wonder this will conveniently lead to an opportunity for Loki to come back again.
Basically, the branch timeline isn't reset. It's transferred to a void at the end of time, where every instance of existence collides at the same point and simply stops. Why? I don't know.
So Loki has a change of heart in merely 5 episodes of a single season right after the mass destruction he caused in Avengers 2012. Whereas his MCU counterpart took years, with his character development being slowly and gradually built throughout impactful moments that explore his complex personality and nature, his relationship with his family, and how everything he went through in 10 years of MCU changed Loki, making him a great Marvel character. And yet, a 6-episode season is enough to make him change after invading a city with a huge army, I guess. Finally, the season finale. So it happens that a godlike figure is the one pulling the strings of everyone and everything. Yet another instance of the show reminded me of the nonsensical concept of free will not existing in the MCU.
Throne of Asgard? No problem.
The people who wrote the show did not pay attention to Loki's arc in all previous movies, and it really shows. Before the Battle of New York in Avengers 2012, Loki did not want the throne of Asgard to begin with.
I never wanted the throne! I only ever wanted to be your equal.
A character who initially was so consumed by jealousy of Thor and so sure that Odin was favoring Thor over him without never knowing the reason why, despite Thor starting off as a vain and reckless man who made disastrous decisions based on his irresponsible short temper and crave for war, while Loki being the responsible and unreasonable one to the point of devising a plan, manipulating people who would be useful to him like pawns, all to depict himself as a devoted son of Odin, the hero who saved his father in Asgard, who was just as worthy as Thor, and not as an inferior frosted giant whose defeat was remembered for ages by the Asgardians to praise Odin's victory over Loki's own people, but as an equal and beloved son of Odin, just like his brother, to the point of being willing to kill his own race. Can the show keep a minimum consistency with what has been previously settled? So the so-called He Who Remains, the one who is responsible for setting all events, character arcs, developments, basically everything, presented like he must be some sort of all-powerful mysterious figure, just happens to be a random dude with terrible dialogue and low-effort funny scenes, a complete buffoon who pruned entire timelines, and everyone who lived in them to the angry cloud. Surprise, surprise, the He Who Remains guy, in the words of that super clock,
He created all. And he controls all. At the end, it is only he who remains.
He knew everything, but not really. For the show could have some stakes, he conveniently only knew everything to a certain point, and the rest he doesn't know what's going to happen. So what was the point of that scene with the stupid clock, of the He Who Remains creating everything and controlling everything, or the dude himself saying that he has seen and knows everything, when it turns out that there is a point where he doesn't know? So Loki starts crying, again, while putting his heart in his sleeve for her. But remember that this is a Loki that invaded a city with a huge army and killed thousands of people not long ago. To go from this to this in a short period of time is not character development. MCU Loki already had that for 10 years in the MCU and they did it wonderfully. In this situation, however, that's simply called character disservice. Let's brace ourselves because we're gonna see tons of that in the near future. And Sylvie killed the He Who Remains and the multiverse war is going to happen. And that's it for the Loki show. It's amazing how Marvel Phase 4 has managed to undermine everything that used to be great in the past a show at a time. Loki himself is a complete disaster, pretty much like everything his own show to be honest. His character goes downhill basically from the very beginning. And towards the end of the show, I had a strong impression that he was becoming more of a secondary character in a show named after him. His own personality gets butchered. The shrewdness, the cleverness, and the cunning way of the god of mischief are simply gone, and a more emotional, nitty, funny Loki shows up instead. There are very scarce moments that give us a quick glimpse of his usual self from his MCU counterpart for a moment or two, but even that doesn't last for too long. There's a point when all this is over and not to be seen again. He follows people around like a puppy, he doesn't talk or behave like he used to in the MCU, especially in Avengers 2012. His initial interactions with Möbius were either tedious, boring conversation scenes or comic relief moments which I really disliked. His mischievous, calculus, deceitful, and trickster nature is gone as well. The moment he's seen using his powers the most is during his fight against Sylvie in episode 6. But given the premises that led us to that moment, it felt mediocre, and he's almost not shown devising cunning, smart plans to make his way to his goals like before, but he is seen making some stupid choices instead, like getting drunk in episode 3. Absolute dumb decisions that put his plans in jeopardy, which MCU Loki, again, especially Avengers 2012 Loki, would never ever do. He's so admitted being a narcissistic, lonely, unhappy person that time loop scene with Lady Sif, and it was truly pathetic. A disservice to his character in every single way. And they gave him this power which was never shown in the MCU and is conveniently never seen again in the show. Loki has a change of heart faster and is seen crying and getting emotional more often in 6 episodes than in a decade of Marvel movies, while those movies actually provided him with far more impactful and sentimental events to go through, like Loki finding out that he is a frost giant adopted by Odin and the death of his parents for instance, which explored his complex personality, enriched his arc, and made his character great. And yet, Loki is seen crying more often in the show that is filled with nonsensical stuff that undermines the premises of the MCU and that also fails to emulate its greatness than his entire arc, which took almost a decade to unravel and develop. Maybe it works for the sake of making those moments in the Loki show sentimental for the audience, but it undermines and ruins Loki's characterization, especially how he was after the first Avengers movie. MCU Loki used to be a formidable opponent in battle. He could fight against Thor, Captain America, but here, he really struggles to fight Sylvie or basically anyone. Literally anyone. And I'm just like, why? Which made me realize how toned down Loki was in almost every single way. If someone comes up with a plan or finds something relevant for the plot, that's usually not him, but someone else instead. So in other words, Loki was mostly reduced to the funny sentimental character while being based from a Loki that was at the peak of his character in Avengers 2012. I couldn't care less about his relationship with Sylvie. Honestly, the whole notion of Loki falling in love for himself through a female variant of him sounds dumb. Maybe the writers wanted this to be a mind-blowing moment like, Loki's self-dating y'all, but honestly, the whole thing sounds simply bad and absurd to me. I also couldn't care less about Sylvie, or anything about her character at all. She starts off as a sassier and more clever version of him. She was told to be the superior version of Loki throughout episode 2, which was annoying and also served to tone down Loki's character even more. But I completely failed to sympathize with her and for her cause, and the fact that towards the end of the show, the Loki show seems to be more about her than the actual protagonist who the show is named after made me dislike this character even more. Möbius was really mediocre and pathetic. Most of his scenes were really boring, plainly exposition scenes with dull dialogue. He also looks so incompetent whenever he is interacting with this character, who also sucks because she's shown to be absolutely incompetent, both as a soldier and as a higher authority. It was also unnerving to see her condescending to Möbius towards the end of the show, or simply stopping or deterring him or his suggestions whenever Möbius wanted to do something that sounded way more effective or smarter than most of her decisions so far. B-15 also sucks. She was insufferable whenever she made fun of Loki, and I also couldn't care less about her journey to find out more about her past. And finally, the whole notion of free will not existing and everything being the result of the will of a higher mysterious authority is pure nonsensical absurd crap. I already talked about my thoughts on what getting rid of free will in the MCU means to me, how it disregards all what those characters we loved had done, how it gets rid of any chance of stakes, development, and stuff, and it baffles me that the screenwriters actually had the audacity of introducing such an infuriatingly terrible plot of depriving all those characters of their free will and the relevance of all they've done in the MCU up until now. So yeah, those were my thoughts about Loki. And now you can see why it was a huge ordeal for me to watch this show. The premises of Loki are a disaster. The show is simply the combination of lack of any understanding of the Marvel franchise, any consideration for previous characterizations, tons of retconning that undermined what made its characters great in the first place, with horrendous writing made by the most talentless people ever. I just wonder if there's something left from the MCU that hasn't been ruined by Phase 4 yet. Anyway, it's all a never-ending nightmare now. So that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching, and if you like my content, consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time around.